from the beginnings of the gatherings of the followers. These two repeated actions were done on a regular weekly basis. We don't know how they were observed. We don't know the varieties of the different ways they did baptism or Lord's Supper in all of these different places. But we know the source of the early patterns. With baptism, the precedent came from the simple fact that Jesus had been baptized by John the Baptizer at the very start of his mission. So the lesson today, the first lesson, comes from Matthew's version of that event. Then Jesus came from Galilee to John at the Jordan to be baptized by him. John would have prevented him, saying, "I need to be baptized by you, and you'd come to me?" But Jesus answered him, "Let it be so now, for it is proper for us in this way to fulfill all righteousness." Then John consented, and when Jesus had been baptized, just as he came up from the water, suddenly the heavens were opened to him, and he saw God's Spirit descend like a dove and alight on him. And a voice from heaven said, "This is my Son, the Beloved, with whom I am well pleased." Baptism, in whatever varied understanding, is at the heart of the Christian experience. One of the central reasons that I chose to become a Presbyterian teaching elder instead of a Baptist minister was the different understanding of this simple central action. Baptism, in whatever understanding, is at the heart, but we see it differently in different names of our life together. There's nothing wrong with a Baptist understanding, but for them, baptism is an act that represents a human response, a choice, the acceptance of Jesus Christ's invitation to be a follower. For Presbyterians, baptism is about God's choice. God's choice for us before we ever were a thinking person. God's grace and mercy always goes before our thought or action. God's creating in love is the source, the very source of our capacity to do the choosing. Why Jesus and this ritual from Hebrew baptisms? It was not, as we often think, to be a cleansing for sin. Hebrews had these rituals of sacrifice for the cleansing of sin. Baptism was a washing, a purification rite. And yes, it was an immersion in natural waters. The Baptists really are right about immersion. It was a full washing. It could be for a ritual of purification, or it could be for a conversion to the Jewish faith. It could be for a restoration to the community after a lapse. Or it could be a qualification and recognition of that for a new kind of participation in the community, a recognition and celebration of calling. John protests because he thinks Jesus does not qualify under any of these varied reasons. Luke tells us that John's mission is the restoration of justice and mercy and compassion to Hebrew life. It's the message of the great prophets, and John stands in their tradition. Jesus tells John, it is proper for us to fulfill all righteousness. Jesus is uniting, is identifying himself in this deep prophetic identity of calling the people to obedience and faithfulness. Jesus acts out this outward sign of a holy and spiritual commitment. He is living God's will in this act. Jesus is inaugurating a new vocation. He wants to place his mission squarely at the center of Hebrew right living. His prophetic mission of cleansing and renewing the Hebrew tradition. And the validation comes in a completely unexpected signs from God. A visible dove, an audible voice. This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. It's a direct reference to Ezekiel's Son of Man, who is the promised Messiah Savior for the people and the nation. So, what did the gatherings of the followers do with this baptizing? It became an action sign of conversion, of transformation, a sign that their lives had been radically changed by a new creation. As Paul says, all things are become new. It is the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes. Baptism also symbolized Christ's death and burial and resurrection. Baptism becomes a sacred worship action by which followers are given to the radically different life of a powerful God who raises the dead to completely new living. So why this font? Why a bowl with water in it? Let's skip over the centuries of the variations of baptism in different times and places. History shows a wide and diverse variety of expressions of baptism in the Christian enterprise. The church is always reforming the core of its life with new circumstances, like children being born. What do we do with these children? And so it's a simple application in infant baptism of the fact that God has created everything in the world and the whole world belongs to God. We, all of us, already belong to God before we know or understand it. The new life we are given is really a genuine life in the creating. We do not choose to belong to God. For Presbyterians, ironically, baptism is not about sin and depravity. It is about how in life and death we belong to God. God's grace is the genuine driving force of creation and of each one of our lives. The old sacred ritual is about God doing, not ours. About God's agape love, out of the compassion and mercy that is our gift without our choosing, before our choosing. Know it or not, accept it or not, we live under the mercy of a faithful Savior who invites us to follow His leading, regardless of our age or understanding. So we continue this ancient ritual precisely because we do not understand it. But as we live to the Lord. And when we die to the Lord. Because whether we live or die, we belong to the Lord. In this action, beyond words, we touch the mystery of the love of God who always comes and rests on us and says, "You belong to me, and I am so pleased with you."